Francisco Franco, absolute ruler over Spain, was one of the most enigmatic dictators in European history. Even today, the country still bears the scars of his reign.
Franco makes an investment in terror, and he lives off the profits of that for the rest of his time.
In a bitter civil war, the general seized power and resolutely clung to it.
Franco's great advantage was not to be too ideological. No other wartime dictator lived and stayed at the top of their country for as long as Franco.
After his death, Spain suffered from Franco's dark legacy, and still does today. The Second World War was now over, and in global politics, changes were taking place. The victorious powers were taking a good look at Spain, because its head of state had, unofficially, been a close ally of Adolf Hitler. Many Spaniards were hoping that Franco would be overthrown and the tyranny brought to an end. Could Franco survive and be acknowledged outside Spain? (1945). At the end of the Second World War, Franco's friendship with the defeated Axis powers put him in a tight spot.
Whereas, obviously Mussolini's murdered, Hitler commits suicide, Franco is not going to do that. The new mask that he put on was the mask that he felt was necessary for survival.
The dictator had to disassociate himself from his old friends. He saw himself not as a fascist, but as a military ruler. His regime, however, had distinctly fascist characteristics. Would the Western powers accept that? As early as July 1945, Franco had the Roman salute banned. Deceptively similar to the Nazi salute, it had been introduced by Franco himself. And he reshuffled his government. The fascist state party, the Falange, which had helped him gain power, was now a threat to his future. Franco threw the fascists out of his cabinet and instead strengthened the Catholic forces in Spain. The appointment of a new foreign minister with close ties to the church was intended to appease the Western powers.
Franco tenía una concepción que se dijo a los aliados.
In reality, in Franco's eyes, the outcome of the Second World War was not so pivotal. He told the Allies quite clearly that what was really important now was the fight against the common enemy, communism, the destroyer of Christian and Western civilization.
But Franco was misguided. What really mattered to the new ruling powers were freedom and democracy. The Potsdam Conference explicitly excluded Spain from all the international community's plans. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin openly called for Franco to be overthrown. But the Western powers did not want another trouble spot in Europe. Even though they disapproved of his regime, Franco did not constitute an acute threat. So he was left to his own devices.
It was assumed that the regime wouldn't last long, that sooner or later, and probably sooner, Franco's Spain would simply disappear.
A close watch was kept on the dictator. The close relations with Nazi Germany had left traces. By the end of the war, there were around 5,000 Germans living in Spain, many of whom had only arrived during the National Socialist era. The The United States in particular feared that Spain could become a safe haven for Nazi war criminals. The Nazi Party's foreign wing had offices and contacts all over the country. In the final months before Hitler's fall, more and more German Nazis had fled to Spain, and Franco had received them with open arms. Lufthansa operated daily flights to Spain until just a few weeks before the end of the war. The Germans controlled key industries in Spain and had established a close network. To curb German influence, the victorious powers wanted to seize German assets in Spain as reparation. In order to see this plan implemented swiftly, they promised Franco's regime 30% of the revenue. With German companies in Spain worth an estimated 400 million euros in today's money, it was a lucrative deal.
The Spanish position was characterized by pronounced pragmatism. They ensured that they helped themselves to the bankruptcy assets of the Third Reich, always claiming that they had been pressurized to do that by the Allies and pointing out that their own Spanish hands had been tied.
This interference by the Allies annoyed Franco. However, the unexpected influx of money was more than welcome. And he sensed the opportunity to destroy German supremacy in the Spanish economy in an elegant way, and without even having to jeopardize his good relations with Germany, because he could hide behind the decision taken by the Allies. The caudillo felt a great affinity for the Germans. He had always marveled at their military achievements. Cultivating contacts with the German community in exile was something the dictator attended to personally. Contact, for example, with SS General Johannes Bernhardt, who in 1936 had persuaded Hitler to support Franco in the Civil War. In gratitude, Franco allowed Bernhardt to build up a lucrative trade empire with the parastatal holding Sofindus. From Spain, the former Mannesmann manager had taken care of virtually the entire exchange of goods with Nazi Germany. Now, after the war, he too had to fear for his future.
Johannes Bernhardt was cunning enough to initially cooperate with the Allies, and for some time this enabled him to avoid being deported, or at least appearing on the lists with which the Allies tried to get Germans sent back to Germany for denazification.
In November 1945, the Allies demanded that Spain deport more than 250 German Nazis. Those being sought became nervous. Many wrote to Franco asking for his protection. And the dictator was happy to help old friends. Not even half of those wanted by the Allies were deported. Another Allied wanted list drawn up in 1947 also contained the name of Johannes Bernhardt, but the former SS officer was able to rely on Franco.
Cuando los aliados le piden
When the Allies demanded his deportation, Franco refused. Instead, he made Bernhardt a Spanish citizen and gave him a house in Denia. There, Bernhardt led a comfortable life, far removed from events during the war. Finally, in 1950, he emigrated to Argentina.
As financial security in his luggage, Bernhardt had a valuable painting by El Greco, a gift from his patron General Franco. In 1948, Allied pressure to have Nazi war criminals deported lessened, and several hundred were able to abscond to South America. The majority headed for Argentina, where its dictator, Juan Perón, granted them political asylum. Attempts by the caudillo to give his regime a veneer of democracy were all too flimsy, because he even openly insisted that the Spanish people needed authoritarian leadership because of their mentality. Franco's closeness to former Nazis and Italian fascists was viewed on the international scene as a serious stigma. So, for the time being, efforts by the Spanish regime to become an equal partner for the Western powers had failed. This international isolation had dramatic consequences for the dictator and, even more, for the Spanish people. Without the protection of his defeated fascist partners Hitler and Mussolini, Franco needed a new strategy for survival. In December 1946, in front of the Royal Palace in Madrid, he took a new tack.
He created the idea, which was utterly fraudulent, but given his control over the media, it worked, that Spain was the victim of a blockade by the Western powers. So people rallied to him. He actually said that the Americans and the British want to bring down Spain because they are jealous of the Falangist regime. And people believe that.
Franco presented his supporters with the tried and tested spectres. The decadent Western democracies and the Soviet communists were in league against Spain, and only he, the caudillo, could protect his people from the threat.
During his time in Morocco, Franco had become convinced that he had been chosen by Providence to play a special role for Spain. And this also gave him a certain strength to survive this period. Above all, he was sure that he could give the country something it hadn't had for a long time: security and stability.
The international community was unimpressed by the new, old sounds coming from Spain. In fact, the newly founded United Nations passed a resolution against Spain. Nearly all ambassadors were recalled from Madrid. Franco was to be put under pressure to pave the way for democracy. New resistance to the dictatorship was also germinating in Spain itself. In many places, supporters of the old republic had gone underground and formed guerrilla units. And they were now receiving support because since the end of the war, Republican fighters had been returning home from France. With the experience they had gained with the French resistance, they wanted to contribute to the struggle against Franco. The anti-Franco movement was supported first and foremost by the Communist Party in exile. It organized militant groups and carried out acts of sabotage designed to demoralize the hated regime. In León, resistance had flourished ever since the Civil War, and it was there in 1942 that the first official guerrilla unit in Spain was formed. Francisco Martínez joined it in 1944 as a 21-year-old. The first fighters from nearby France soon arrived as support.
They returned in 1945. In those days, we still believed that Franco would not receive international recognition. They spent 2 or 3 enthusiastic years with us. They were all here voluntarily, but we weren't. That's why we also differed in our strategies. Basically, they kept to themselves. But our principle was to foster close ties with the people, with the villages, with the children, with the women, with everyone. Without the women and children, guerrilla activities would have been impossible. It is only thanks to them that we were able to survive in enemy territory.
Martínez had supported the guerrillas for years as a messenger boy. Like many people in the region, his mother also sympathized with the left-wing republic. Regions with difficult terrain and a weak infrastructure offered the resistance fighters good hiding places. Guerrilla units were especially active in Spain's mountainous regions, but they also fought in some major cities like Barcelona, where independence for Catalonia was also a goal. Franco wanted to keep the political resistance under wraps, so guerrilla attacks were rarely reported by the state media. On no account was the resistance to strike a chord with the people. If newspapers carried any reports at all, it was to depict the guerrilla activities as the work of common criminals. Yet since 1947, the regime had been reacting with marked severity. The punitive activities of the secret police were designed to hit not only the fighters themselves, but also their families and those who supported them.
They sent members of the secret police to mingle with the people and look for anyone who was prepared to betray us. At the same time, people no longer showed any enthusiasm for resistance. It all came together. The result was total failure without any prospects for the future. If we'd stayed for just one more year, they would have murdered us all.
Francisco Martinez managed to flee to France. Demoralized by Franco's repression, like him, many fighters left the country. It was not until many years later, as a pensioner, that Martinez returned to Spain. Hopes that Spain's dictatorship would also topple like its counterparts in Germany and Italy were dashed. The Western powers had no interest in intervening in Spain, and internally Franco's power could not be shaken.
Franco wanted to make sure that on the surface everything was calm and under control, even though appalling things might be being done in various sort of dungeons and cells, in prisons and in police headquarters.
Part of the population stood behind Franco, and the opposition was brutally silenced.
The repression after 1939 was far and away the worst in Spain's entire history. Europe has never seen the level of brutality which followed the Spanish Civil War.
In the Civil War, Marcos Ana was a political commissar on the side of the Republicans. As a result, he spent nearly 23 years in prison. In the attempt to work through his terrible experiences, he began to write.
We were taken to Madrid for sentencing and put in the cellars of the Directorate for Security. You weren't sent there to stay for long, but to be tortured, to point the finger at comrades, to be broken.
The prisons were hopelessly overcrowded, the conditions appalling. Consequently, many inmates were used as forced labor outside the prisons. Others were eliminated by the regime.
They arrested comrades every day, except Saturdays. In their hypocrisy, they didn't want to shoot people on a Sunday. On all other days, however, some of my colleagues saw the sunrise for the last time, and I lived in that hell.
It's estimated that by the end of the Second World War, Franco's regime had executed 200,000 people. Often, the victims were shot without trial. Throughout Spain, nameless victims from the time lay buried anonymously. It was only in 1951 that activists began to open the graves. Since then, some 25,000 corpses have been recovered and identified. Only a fraction of those killed.
One
of Franco's most sinister executioners once said, "The left will not stir again for 20 or 30 years." And it didn't.
Y efectivamente, es lo que pasa.
The atmosphere of terror, the atmosphere of fear, was there right from the start. And it was well known, you know, the screams from, say, the Dirección General de Seguridad in the Plaza del Sol in Madrid was enough, if you like, to keep people in the capital well aware of what would happen to them if they actually started to work against the regime.
Units of the Guardia Civil and the secret police kept the Spanish people under total surveillance. The many years of terror left deep marks. Fear became part of everyday life. Many people preferred to stay well away from politics and focused instead on coping with their daily problems. Because the start of the post-war period had seen no change in the disastrous supply situation. A large proportion of the population continued to suffer from hunger and poverty. How could anyone still believe the regime's promises? The isolation policy was clearly making everything even worse. If the situation was to improve, Franco urgently needed international loans, but he was turned down. He was now forced to rely on the help of the few friends he had. Appreciable support came especially from Argentina, where Juan Perón had been president since 1946. Perón, like Franco, a general and fascist sympathizer, granted loans and approved deliveries of grain. This meant that at least the worst of the famine in Spain could be combated. Without Perón's help, the impoverished country could scarcely have survived. As a special gesture of friendship, in 1947, Perón sent his wife Evita to Madrid. The visit by the glamorous 28-year-old was accompanied by many rumors. Franco's wife, Carmen, for instance, is said to have forbidden her husband to travel around Spain alone with Evita.
Franco, although there are doubts about his sexuality, always seemed to have an eye for the ladies. And this was something that his wife was very aware of. So when Evita came, who was very beautiful, apparently there was a big competition between her and Mrs. Franco.
Spain's First Lady wanted to match the young Argentinian in every way, at least with regard to fashion. On one occasion, apparently despite the summer heat, Franco's wife even wore her finest fur coat. Evita Perón was intended to bring a touch of glamour to destitute Spain and distract its people from their woes.
Evita was a populist. She was more of a fascist in terms of, you know, a populist, modernizing regime and so on. That wasn't Franco. I would be surprised if there was much of a meeting of minds.
Franco was happy for Evita's great popularity to let him too appear in a glittering light. For the dictator, this was the first important state visit after the Civil War. Franco's propaganda made the foreign boycott responsible for Spain's misery. Primarily, however, that misery was homemade. Since 1939, Franco's regime had aspired to self-sufficiency, total independence from other countries. But this policy had led Spain down a dramatic blind alley. In industry and agriculture, there was a shortage of everything.
The way that Franco's propaganda tried to blame an international sort of bloc against it was, of course, trying to make a virtue out of necessity, trying to say that this was sort of ideological and all the rest of it, when in fact the incompetence of the running of the economy was abysmal.
Spain was still an agricultural country. It lacked all the prerequisites for a self-sufficient economy: raw materials, infrastructure, and the necessary expertise. In the early 50s, ambitious prestige projects were launched, which, it was hoped, would change the situation. Franco wanted to bring about an economic revival by force. His favorite project involved dams. During his rule, the caudillo had several hundred of them constructed all over Spain. Above all, the dams were designed to improve the water supply to Spain's extensive arid regions. Agriculture was particularly dependent on water. Now, new farming colonies were established everywhere. In regions of low productivity, the state distributed land to settlers' families, who were to make the land arable. Soon, nearly 300 of these colonies existed. Águeda del Caudillo in the province of Salamanca is one of the villages which were founded. The settlers saw it as a chance to escape from the misery in Spain.
When we came here, we started virtually from scratch. They gave us seed, and we plowed the soil with donkeys as best we could.
Not everyone knew what to do with the plots, least of all me.
The prospect of a house and a plot of land attracted some 55,000 families from all over Spain to the new colonies. But only those who declared their loyalty to Franco were allowed to settle in them. The more helping hands, the better. So, large families were particularly welcome. It was important to the buffeted regime for the colonization program to be a success. The expectations placed on settlers were high. Good harvests, it was hoped, would finally put an end to the famine. The dictator opened the colonies personally, a special honor for the new farmers.
I thought it was great because there were lots of people there. And then the Generalissimo, you know, Franco, he stood up there and spoke to the people. As a child, of course, that really impressed me. I couldn't believe it. My goodness, what a man.
When it was officially opened in 1954, like many other colonies, Águeda had Del Caudillo added to its name. It was not until 2016 that this reverence to Franco was removed. Political activists had taken the issue to court. Many people in Águeda are still grateful to the dictator even today. They were able to build up a livelihood on a piece of land which Franco had taken away from the big landowners, as a supposed benefactor of the poor. Often, though, the soil was barren. Many farmers found it hard to live from the harvest and pay taxes as well. Time and again, settler families had to give up.
We'd already had a vegetable patch, so I knew what I was doing. But what if you've no experience? Many people came from outside and had no idea. They didn't produce anything and had to hand over their land to someone else.
Franco's propaganda sold the colony program as a successful land reform. But in reality, yields were well below expectations. The winners were the wealthy big landowners who still pocketed substantial compensation for land that was worthless. In Spain, social inequality was part of everyday life. Nepotism and corruption ensured that the upper class retained its privileges. While millions starved, the elite wallowed in absolute luxury. Franco's family was no exception. Carmencita, the dictator's daughter, had an extravagant lifestyle, and his siblings were involved in suspect business dealings. Franco himself was not too concerned with luxury. He profited in a different way. By enabling his minions to live off the fat of the land, he ensured their loyalty.
Since he himself was corrupt, he regarded it as perfectly normal for people to be bought off.
Franco's wife is regarded as the central figure in this system. Doña Carmen had a major influence on decisions taken by her husband, and she enjoyed her power to the full.
It is said that whenever she went anywhere, in Spain, she'd go to jewelers' shops and she'd say, oh, that's a nice piece, I like this and whatever. And anyone who claimed that, for the bill to be paid would suddenly find they were subject to tax inspections.
Many decisions in Spain were taken not by institutions, but by individuals with power. So good contacts were helpful.
People's abilities to set up businesses, to import various items, all depended on who you knew within the movement or within the national bureaucracy. I think in Spain, the corruption was so great, particularly at higher levels in the administration, that it was actually making any form of economic development almost impossible.
Other European countries like Germany benefited in their reconstruction from the Marshall Plan. Franco's Spain was denied this help, but other prospects soon presented themselves. The Cold War improved Franco's situation considerably. Since 1947, the countries of the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, and the Western powers, dominated by the United States, had been competing in an arms race. The world was divided into two hostile blocs: socialism versus the free market economy. Europe was at the focal point of the arms race, which soon involved nuclear weapons. With the possibility of a Third World War looming, both sides were busily gathering potential allies. Spain could be a valuable partner in the conflict with the Eastern Bloc, but NATO, the Western alliance, saw no place in its ranks for Franco. Reservations regarding the dubious despot were too great. Franco was furious. After all, was it not he who for years had propagated the fight against communism?
Franco reacted with total incomprehension to the attitude by the Western powers. He had been absolutely convinced that he would be accepted into the Western Defensive Alliance.
And indeed, the US government was beginning to think again. Maybe the Nazis' former friend should be included after all.
The Pentagon exerted more and more influence. It spoke a totally different language, pointing out time and again that it was simply impossible for Europe, for the Mediterranean, and for the Straits of Gibraltar to be defended effectively without the participation of Spain.
As the threat of war increased, Spain assumed more and more strategic importance. In the event of a Soviet attack, Spain could be useful as a place of refuge, but also as a bridgehead in Europe. In 1950, the Korean War broke out, making the situation even more critical. In NATO, Washington got its way. Spain was to be given a role in the defense of the West. At the same time, at the United Nations, America advocated Franco's rehabilitation. After 4 years of isolation, Franco was brought in out of the cold.
When the UN lifted its sanctions in 1950, the regime's reaction was to say, they have realized that we were right. The sanctions were unjustified, and Spain did not bow and scrape.
La estrategia occidental precisa una pieza, España. La ONU por mayoría acuerda dar libertad para que vuelvan a Madrid los embajadores. Con tal motivo, la televisión americana pide al caudillo unas declaraciones.
Si para el mundo tiene hoy extraordinario valor el que el comunismo no se haya sentado en este extremo occidental de Europa, creo tener derecho a que se corrijan los yerros que con nosotros se cometieron.
The boycott and isolation had ended. Foreign ambassadors returned to Madrid. And the people of Spain waited full of hope for an upswing. And indeed, to a certain extent after 1951, the economic situation improved. The United States approved the first loans to Spain. Then Europe followed suit. Urgently needed investment in industry and agriculture thus became possible. After years of stagnation, the Spanish economy at last had the chance to get going again. And it wasn't only the political situation that was kind to Spain. In 1951, extensive rainfall ended the devastating droughts of previous years. The major famine was over. Spain's farmers gathered in record harvests. Consequently, in 1952, it was possible to end food rationing, earlier than in Great Britain. The improved food supply situation also offered relief to Franco. A nation that is starving can also be a threat to a dictator. With the end of international isolation, his regime had survived its most difficult crisis. But the Western powers were still far from seeing Franco as an equal partner.
The Western democracies never really acknowledged the dictatorship. They didn't want it. They tolerated it. They did business with it. But they told Franco quite clearly, until you respect basic human rights, and until you have a democracy like ours, we do not want you. End of story.
The international community of nations still saw the dictator as nothing more than a necessary evil. So Franco now began to focus more on the power of the Vatican. More than 90% of Spaniards are Catholics, and many of them are devoutly religious. The Catholic Church, and the Vatican in particular, had exercised great influence in Spain for many years. Franco sought a concordat, a treaty with the Holy See.
On the one hand, this would have a domestic impact. But on the other hand, a concordat would also make an impression internationally. It would enable Franco's Spain to present itself as a Catholic country within the framework of worldwide Catholicism.
A concordat would underscore Franco's temporal and religious claim to power. A cunning tactician, he was well aware of the worldwide influence of the Catholic Church.
The important thing was that Franco was seen to go to Mass. I mean, I don't think Franco was remotely religious.
In 1953, a new concordat was signed between Rome and Spain. The left-wing republic had terminated the old treaty in 1931. In contrast to Franco, the church leaders were in no hurry. Initially, the Vatican was hesitant to bind itself officially to the dictator. But the agreement assured the clergy in Spain of extensive privileges. In return, the dictator tied the bishops to his regime even more closely, and could thus demand their unrestricted loyalty. For many Spaniards, the alliance between state and church was to have far-reaching consequences.
They were given complete control over education, over censorship, and above all over the orphanages. So from that point of view, Franco knew perfectly well that these children would be brainwashed into becoming, you know, basically loyal nationalist Franquist supporters in the future.
Hardly anyone dared say that they were not a Catholic. People were afraid to be different. It was a case of el que dirán. What will people say if I sheer away from official Catholic thinking? In this respect, the Church had a psychological presence, which few were able to breach. Even kissing in public was an offense, escándalo público.
One of the darkest chapters in the cooperation between Church and Franco's regime is the widespread abduction of children. At the time, this was kept a strict secret, but for many years, a network of priests, doctors and children's homes brought unhappiness to parents and their offspring. The government systematically had children taken away from parents who opposed the fascist regime. In many cases, the parents were in prison, or they had even been murdered. With the help of the Church, their children were to be brought up in homes to become good Christians and followers of Franco. Or they were sold to couples loyal to the regime who wanted a family. The aim was to deprive socialism in Spain of new blood.
The original aspiration was to missionize Spain. In other words, to remove all these demons from the Republic and from Spanish society through intensive mission work, and to create the foundations of a society oriented towards Catholic principles and Catholic dogma. But in the final analysis, this goal proved unattainable.
In the early 50s, the missionary motives gradually faded into the background. By then, the Franco regime had already taken children away from 30,000 women. The organized abduction of children was also a lucrative business. Nurses lied to mothers, telling them that their child had died soon after birth. This deception was necessary because the burial of an infant dying after its first day of life had to be documented. This way, the crime could never come to light. The sinister adoption business even continued until the late 90s, long after the Franco dictatorship had come to an end. It was not until the early years of the new century that the scandal became public. Since then, many Spaniards have been plagued by the question of who their true family is. Pilar Navarro helps the victims of organized child abduction in their search for truth. Her own daughter was stolen from her under the Franco regime.
I gave birth to my child in a private clinic run by the Sisters of Charity. She lay at my breast, but they took her away from me straight away. I was told that she had respiratory problems and needed to be put in an incubator. We were concerned, so our father went down to the incubator to see her. When he asked to see her a second time, a nun told us that the clinic lacked the necessary technology, so they had had to transfer the child to another hospital. Less than 24 hours after the birth, they came to us once again to say that our daughter had died. We needn't have any worries, they said, because everything had already been taken care of. She had even been baptized, they claimed. We were so overcome with pain and grief that we never imagined she might not have died, that we should perhaps have questioned what the nuns told us. In many respects, hospitals run by nuns traditionally had the best reputation.
Pilar Navarro is still searching for her daughter. Hospitals and the church brush her off and refuse to provide any information. But she refuses to give up. Indeed, since 2017, Pilar Navarro has also continued her fight through the courts.
The state has given us no help whatsoever. The families affected and the children who were stolen have received no assistance in taking vital steps in their search. The people who committed the crimes are being protected.
But those affected are joining forces. The number of children who were stolen is put at 300,000.
False birth certificates, DNA samples, statements from nurses or from parents who bought children. It is with information of this kind that the Public Prosecutor's Office will be carrying out its investigations. My daughter was taken after 3 days. They stole my twin sister from my parents.
I want to know where I come from and find my mother, who is perhaps looking for me too. Do I have siblings? No idea.
Gene databases could still clear up a lot of cases and bring families together again. But there is only a slim chance that most of those who are guilty can ever be brought to book. Large-scale child abduction, the disquieting end of a totalitarian system with the blessing of the Catholic Church. But the caudillo sought not only spiritual help, but also solid political support. The Cold War made Franco an important strategic partner. In 1953, the United States and Spain signed a Status of Forces agreement. Franco consented to the establishment of US bases and in return received economic and military aid. The Americans had thus achieved their goal, and without the Spanish dictator becoming a member of NATO. 3 aircraft bases were built. In addition, in Rota in Andalusia, a large naval base was established, the only one in mainland Europe for US submarines armed with nuclear missiles. An 800-kilometer-long pipeline supplied the bases with fuel. In addition, smaller military facilities were set up all over Spain. The US Air Force still uses 2 of the bases today. The deal with the American Armed Forces appeared to be good business for Franco. The Generalissimo collected $350 million in military aid in the first 5 years alone. The economic aid he received consisted of food, animal fodder, and artificial fertilizer, as well as raw materials for manufacturing consumer goods. And wherever it proved useful to the Americans, Spain's infrastructure was also improved. Spanish propaganda celebrated the signing of the treaty as a major triumph, and Franco as a far-sighted statesman. But critical voices were also raised.
When objections were being made in Spain in terms of, do we want nuclear-armed American aircraft to be stationed next door to Madrid, all of these kind of objections. Franco instructed the diplomats who were engaged in the negotiations, do whatever is necessary, but get this agreement.
It was not a deal between equals.
Para Franco era vital.
Politically, it was important to Franco for survival. But for the Americans, it was a purely military agreement. Naturally, they were well aware of Franco's weak bargaining position and got as much out of it as they could. Franco had made Spain completely available to them.
In the event of a worst-case scenario, Washington would have complete freedom of action on the bases. This was guaranteed by additional clauses, something the regime concealed right to the end. In a Third World War, the deal would have made Spain the target for Soviet nuclear missiles. The dangers of this military cooperation, even in peacetime, became evident in January 1966. In a collision with another aircraft over Palomares in Andalusia, an American B-52 bomber lost 4 hydrogen bombs. None of the bombs exploded, but on impact, 2 released radioactive radiation. 1,400 tons of contaminated earth had to be removed. Traces of this radioactive contamination can still be measured today. It was not until 80 days later that the 4th bomb was salvaged from the sea. The people of Spain were told virtually nothing about the magnitude of the accident. Secretly, however, even the dictator was furious at the clauses in the Status of Forces Agreement. The American services in return were small comfort in view of the immense safety risks for Spain.
On the quiet, Franco would complain. He'd say, the only good thing the Americans have done is bring business for prostitutes.
But the deal with the United States also had a global political dimension. Washington and the Vatican had now signed agreements with Franco. This meant that the victor in the Civil War had at last achieved some international recognition. And in 1959, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower even paid a visit to Franco's dictatorship.
When Eisenhower came to visit, you can see Franco is crying. It's a kind of endorsement of his ambition. You know, here I am with the greatest man on earth, and I'm his equal.
Franco saw himself in the company of the Western powers.
Well, for the opposition, of course, it was extremely depressing in a way because they had hoped that the regime would simply collapse out of its own incompetence.
Eisenhower's visit was a kind of accolade.
It was of major importance to Franco personally. It finally secured his power position in Spain.
Franco, it seemed, had shed his fascist reputation. But what was the dictator planning for Spain's future?